in American history.
James Mann, Sunday night at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A.
In Minnesota's 7th Congressional District, Democratic Congressman Collin Peterson is seeking a 15th term in Congress. He debated his Republican opponent, Dave Hughes. They discussed trade, health care, North Korea, Iran, and the national debt. This is about an hour.
Welcome to Prairie Public and AARP's continuing coverage of Election 2018. I'm Matt O'Lean. Tonight, the debate for Minnesota's 7th District Congressional seat. My guests tonight are Democratic Representative Collin Peterson and Republican Dave Hughes. Each candidate will have a up to 90-second opening and closing statement they can use with topics and debates in between. Based on a coin flip, Congressman Peterson will go first on opening statement.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank Prairie Public and AARP for once again sponsoring this debate. It's been many years we've been doing this, and we appreciate it. It's been my honor to be able to serve the people of the 7th District of Minnesota in the People's House. The House of Representatives is the only branch of the federal government where you can't serve unless you're elected. And that's done on purpose in the Constitution, so it gives the opportunity for people to bring their ideas and grievances to the federal government on an equal basis across the country. So our job as Congress people is to go out and consult with our people, the folks that know the most about these issues, the people who have things that they want done by the federal government, and take that job back to Washington, back to the House of Representatives, and try to enact those things into law. And I've tried to do that in the time that I've been in this office on a bipartisan basis. I think that shouldn't be what you worry about when you bring these issues forward. It should be what the people of this district want, what is needed, and kind of the partisanship should be kind of second in line. I guess because of that, the Lugar Center, which is an outfit formed by former U.S. Senator Dick Lugar, a Republican from Indiana, I was proud to be named the most bipartisan member of the House in 2017, and that was done based on...
That's 90 seconds.
Okay, based on the bills that we...
Okay, Dave Hughes, opening statement.
Good evening. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Prairie Public Television and AARP for making this possible. My name is Dave Hughes. I am the Republican candidate for Congress in Minnesota's 7th Congressional District. I'm a 21-year active duty retired U.S. Air Force officer, pilot, and combat veteran. I am running for Congress to preserve and protect the American dream for my children and their children, to be a conservative reinforcement in the Republican majority U.S. House of Representatives, and most important, to partner with our President, President Donald J. Trump, to help him accomplish the America First agenda as quickly as possible. We need to secure the border, lower taxes, promote agriculture, open foreign trade and make these trade deals better. We need to repeal Obamacare. And I'm confident that if the people of Western Minnesota entrust me and vote for me on November 6th, that I will work with the President and with the Congress to get that done. I humbly ask for your vote. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's get to our first topic, and let's start with trade and tariffs, a huge issue right now with the U.S., Canada, Mexico agreement as well. Where do each of you stand on the President's trade war and tariffs? How has it impacted farmers in the 7th District so far? And what do each of you think of the President's bailout to help farmers? Dave Hughes, you start us off on this issue.
Thank you, Matt. All across the district, I've been all throughout the district, the 38 counties, and every farmer I talk to, with very few exceptions, says the same thing, which is that they don't like the tariffs. It's painful. It's hurting their business. But the very next sentence they say, but we get it, and we understand what the President is doing, we trust him, and we support what he's doing. They don't give him unlimited time. They say that we need to resolve all this by next spring. And so we've seen progress recently with the EU, with South Korea, most recently with the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, in which the Class 7 dairy program was completely scrapped, and that is of huge benefit to the dairy farmers of Western Minnesota. Also the grain program, which was right off the bat automatically graded as feed grade, that's been scrapped, and so the grain farmers of Western Minnesota are very happy about that. So it's a tough situation right now, but the President has made a a lot of progress recently. The farmers realize that, and we've just got to get the one last thing done, which is a really great agreement with China. I have met with, about a month ago, with a representative from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and she gave me a lot of insight into their process and how they're doing that, and I'm confident that we'll get this done.
Okay, Collin Peterson, response?
Well, I'm, not, as optimistic about how the outcome is going to be with China, and I hope I'm wrong. One thing I do think is positive, that the redoing of the NAFTA didn't come out as bad as some of the ag groups had worried about. We were concerned about our dairy market in Mexico and so forth. So marginal gains in the redoing of NAFTA, really not doing any damage to agriculture. But the China situation, I know what the president is getting at. And I voted against letting China into the WTO way back when in the 1990s, when they got into the WTO. And the reason I did was because I knew how China behaved. I had been to China. They require, if you go over there and do business, you have to set up a new company. You got to give 51% of that company to the Chinese government. You keep 49%, and then you can do business in their market. We knew that going into this. And that's what the president's trying to fix. And I get that. But the other side of that is that we gained, because when we gave those jobs away to China, and we did, the people in the rural parts of China that were farming moved to the city. And we picked up that market. And I don't see where the upside of this outcome is for agriculture. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't see the upside. I think there's only going to be downside. And I hope that this thing gets over sooner rather than later, and farmers are concerned because we're already getting low prices, and this is just putting more pressure on the price structure.
Okay, Dave Hughes, response?
Well, there's plenty of upside. Collin just said he doesn't see the upside. I talked about the upside with regard to the Canada agreement. We've had some improvements recently with South Korea and with the EU, and with China I'm confident that we're going to see an upside. They need our soybeans, and Brazil and others are not able to supply all the supply that they need. So I'm confident going forward, whether it's the WTO issue or anything else, that the president, with his America First agenda, unlike administrations in the past, he's going to get the job done.
Okay, Collin Peterson.
Well, the Mexico-Canada deal, Class 7 was not eliminated. The only thing that happened was we have an ability under the dispute mechanism to try to stop Canada if they dump powder into the world market that comes out of this whole Class 7 situation. So it is not clear, and we haven't seen the final language. I think it's an improvement over the current situation, but to say that they've eliminated Class 7 is not true. That much I know. And the question is, in all these trade agreements, the devil's in the details. So I'm hoping that this is more positive than negative, but we will see.
Okay, let's move on to the Farm Bill, which is currently being negotiated. Where does it stand right now? What do each of you think of it? Some provisions you'd like to see, SNAP programs, other things like that. Maybe some comments on that. And Congressman Peterson, you start us off with this one.
Well, I'm one of the 4 people that's negotiating this agreement. I've been back to D.C. a number of times since we've been out of session. We're still hung up on certain provisions. We're hung up in the commodity title because the Chairman Conaway, is trying to get some additional relief for cotton farmers in Title I. And there's objections from Senator Roberts and Senator Stabenow to that. So that's been a hang-up. There's some objections to the conservation title, and we're not through all of that. And the biggest problem is the changes in SNAP. And what's in this bill is what killed the bill in 2013. The amendment that Eric Cantor put on the bill in 2013 killed the bill, first time in history. And it took us 9 months to get it back on track again. And I tried to warn the chairman that we could work with them on the real problem, which is waivers. We have work requirements. We've had work requirements in SNAP since '96. The problem is we allowed waivers, and we've allowed these states to go in and request waivers. And so we've got 20, 30 some states that have waivers, and to some extent in the different counties. That's what needs to be worked on, and that's what I tried to get the chairman to do. We had 3 meetings to try to see if we could move this thing to a place where we could maybe get a bipartisan agreement. And at the third meeting, he said to me, I'm sorry, I cannot negotiate with you. This is it. There's no more negotiating. And so we kind of were at impasse for a while, and now we're back in conference and we're trying to work this out.
Okay, Dave Hughes, response?
Well, Collin Peterson has had 28 years in Congress to fix the SNAP program. If waivers and issues of work provisions have been a long issue, as he asserted, why hasn't he done anything in 28 years? The Republican proposal this year with regard to the Farm Bill, with regard to SNAP, was very modest. Right now, the federal statute says that from age 18 to 49, if you want the benefits past a certain period of time, you have to either work 20 hours a week or receive job training 20 hours a week. All the Republicans wanted to do was to extend that age from 49 to 59. You would think that Collin and the Democrats thought that the world was coming to an end. It's not a dramatic proposal. It's actually rather modest. And in response to that, rather than working with Chairman Conaway and the Republican majority in the Agriculture Committee, he walked away for 7 or 8 weeks. Wouldn't offer amendments, wouldn't offer suggestions, wouldn't speak to the chairman, wouldn't offer any help. I think that's conduct unbecoming of a statesman, and that's why we are where we are now with an expired farm bill. If he had stuck to the job and done his job, we might have a farm bill right now, and certainly before the fiscal year began. But instead, we're in a situation with a lapsed farm bill that has caused uncertainty, and funding in the conservation programs is unavailable. So it's a bad situation that could have been avoided and should have been avoided. And if I was in Congress right now, I certainly wouldn't have let that happen.
Okay, Collin Peterson, response?
Well, we are at an impasse, and it's not because I walked away or anything like that. It's because the chairman would not compromise, would not even talk to anybody about changing things. The Senate voted 30 to 68 not to do what the House put in the bill. They are not going to do this no matter what. And so I didn't put this in the bill. And I don't know how you go and talk to somebody when he says it's non-negotiable and I got nothing to talk to you about. We continued to work on all the rest of the bill. We just didn't have discussions on the SNAP proposals. So, if you're going to get a bill done, you've got to have a bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. And we had a partisan bill in the House, completely partisan bill, and over in the Senate they had a bipartisan bill. And the reason we can't get them together is because they're so different. And, we've been sitting in this room trying to work it out, and I think we will work it out. We came out of the last meeting agreeing that we're going to get the language together and get the CBO scores and the stuff drafted by the week we get back after the election, and we want to get this done. So I think we will get there. We are starting to make some progress, but it was not me that put this stuff in the bill. And the Senate, Pat Roberts, the Republican senator, the chairman of the committee, told them this isn't going to fly. So,
Okay, Dave Hughes, last word on the Farm Bill, and then we'll move on to another topic.
Well, it's fine for Collin to say that the Senate didn't like the bill, but his job in the U.S. House is to work with the Republican majority in the House to get it done. And he didn't. So if he had, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in right now.
Okay, our next question comes from our co-sponsor, AARP. It's about Social Security. What is your positions on strengthening Social Security for current and future generations? And also Senator McConnell has made some comments recently about there may have to be some cuts coming and things like that. So Dave Hughes, why don't you start out on Social Security?
Social Security is one of the most important programs in this country. My position with regard to it is that we need to start now on the work of fixing it. Right now, the trustees of Social Security project that it will go insolvent in 2034. And related but a different program, Medicare, is that it's going to go insolvent in 2026. Members of Congress who've been there for a long, long time have known this for decades and yet have not sat down and started the hard work. They talk about it from time to time. Collin talked earlier today in another venue about the fact that they had upped the eligibility age for the recipients back in the 90s. But that's one thing in a 30-year span. And what we really need to do now is sit down and come up with a solution. Any solution that I would agree to, and what we need to do is sit down and talk to experts on both sides of the aisle politically, but any solution that I would agree to would not affect the benefits of the current recipients. It would have to be some sort of phased-in thing that would not take away benefits of current recipients. And so we need to look to the future and start now, rather than waiting until 2033 when it's a year away and it becomes a crisis. That's what leaders do. They look on the horizon and they look at the issues and they start now.
Okay, Collin Peterson, response?
Well, this is another of those big issues that are not going to get resolved unless there's a bipartisan solution. This cannot be done with one party, whichever party it is, and make it stick. The problem is we have had no working together in the Ways and Means Committee on a bipartisan basis. That committee has become totally partisan, like everything else in the Congress. You know, and this is the first election that I can remember that the people are bringing up to me what is going on in Washington with the gridlock and the partisanship and the negativity. That's what they're bringing up, not issues. You know, and people are very concerned and upset about the way things are operating. You know, and our party is not in the majority. You know, the Republicans are in the majority in both the House and the Senate. So I'm willing to get to the table and work on this, but it's got to be done on a bipartisan basis. And, you know, it's got to be reasonable solutions. And I am not in favor of cutting benefits to people on Social Security or people on Medicare. I'm opposed to that. You know, and the Medicare part of the payroll tax doesn't have a cap on it. The Social Security part of it does. One of the things we could do is inch that cap up a little bit, and we no longer have an insolvent situation with Social Security. So there's some things that can be done without affecting benefits.
Okay, Dave Hughes, response?
Well, upping that cap is something that Collin mentioned 2 years ago. What has he done in the last 2 years since he mentioned it at our last debate? Certainly that would be a possible solution. There's really three general solutions if you're going to keep Social Security in its present structure. One is to increase the taxes, such as that cap. The other would be to increase the eligibility age. The other would be to reduce benefits, or a combination of all three of those things. I'm not standing here today to tell you that I favor any of those, but if you were going to keep Social Security in its present structure, the reforms would have to be any of a variation of those three things. What I'm suggesting is that we sit down afresh and talk to experts on both sides of the aisle, certainly in a bipartisan fashion, in a regular order format, and talk about the whole range of options so that we can get going on reforms in a bipartisan fashion, iteration after iteration until it's time to implement it, but way before this 2034 insolvency date. And really, you know, just upping the cap and throwing a little more cash at the present structure really is kicking the can down the road. And I favor something more permanent where we don't face insolvency anytime in the near future.
Okay, last word on this.
You know, I would be thrilled if the Republicans would actually come and work with us on a bipartisan basis on this issue. But they're not. And the same thing with the Farm Bill. When we tried to work with them, what did they do? They went completely partisan. And this is what's wrong in Washington. This is what's wrong with the country right now, is we've got a partisan situation, frankly, on both sides of the aisle. There's hardly anybody left in the middle. And that's where we need to get if we're going to get this country governed the way that it needs to be. And so there's been no reaching out on a bipartisan basis from the House Republicans that I'm aware of. And that's what needs to happen before anything is going to get done here.
Okay, follow-up question also from AARP on Medicare and the Affordable Care Act. How will each of you work to preserve and strengthen Medicare for current seniors and future generations? And what's your position on the ACA? Is it the law of the land or not, or are there more repeals coming? Congressman Peterson, you start on this one.
Well, I didn't vote for the ACA, but I have not voted to repeal it. And the main reason is one of the good things we got out of the ACA was the guarantee that pre-existing conditions were going to be covered. And I don't see in the repeal of the ACA any way that's been put forward that guarantees that we're going to be able to keep, you know, pre-existing conditions in the current healthcare system if the ACA is repealed. Just yesterday, day before, I had a bunch of juvenile diabetes kids in my office. I had a young fellow named Noah who I've been seeing since he was 6. He's now 12. You know, and he's been helped greatly by some of the things that we've done. That family wouldn't have health care coverage if we didn't have pre-existing conditions covered. So the problem I have with repealing the ACA is you're going to repeal, there are some good things in there, and you're going to repeal those, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to keep them or to reenact them, and that's the big problem I have with that. In terms of the Medicare system, you know, it works pretty good. I'm on Medicare. You know, and most of us that are on Medicare, we are pleased with the system. The one thing I would suggest, the people who are having trouble are people 55 to 65 right now. They're having to work to keep their insurance and all that kind of stuff. One thing I think we should consider is allowing people 55 to 65 to buy into Medicare on an actuarial basis to help solve some of their problems.
Okay, Dave Hughes, response.
Sure, I'll respond to Medicare and ACA, but I just want to mention this this whole notion of bipartisanship. Collin talks about bipartisanship as if his side is perfect and our side is completely lacking in it. I want to point out that 2 years ago when we were here, Collin said that he could vote for tax reductions and tax reform if it contains certain provisions for corporate situations. He said that in 2016, and then when he had a chance to vote for it last fall, he voted against it. And I would argue that his explanation, his public explanation for it back then, indicated that it was just him going lock and step with his caucus. Same thing with Obamacare. He said way back in 2009 that one of the reasons why he voted against it was because of the provisions for pre-existing conditions, because he knew it would be horrendously expensive. Now he opposes it and won't vote for repeal because of that. Now, with regard to Medicare, the biggest question with regard to Medicare is the situation of insolvency and the fact that we're only 7.5 years away from it. Collin didn't mention anything about it other than to say that he likes the program. We need to sit down and look at the insolvency issue of Medicare. There's a whole host of things to be solved, including fraud, a massive amount of fraud every year in Medicare. So we need to sit down, reform the program, but begin sooner rather than later. Don't kick the can down the road. And then with regard to ACA, we need to completely repeal it. Notwithstanding the incorrect judgment of the Supreme Court, it is an unconstitutional program in my opinion. But either way, whether you want to argue that or not, it doesn't work. It's a failed public policy, and we need to look at it from the context of 330 million Americans, not a few anecdotal instances where somebody has coverage now who didn't have it before, but what has it done to the 1,000 other families for every one of those individuals that benefited? Rates are way through the roof, as are deductibles, and so it needs to be reformed sooner rather than later.
Okay, Collin Peterson responds.
I never said that I didn't support pre-existing conditions. You know, when I voted against the bill, I said there are good parts of this bill, and that was one of the good parts. There are other parts that I thought were a big mistake because too much government involved, and some of the rest of it in setting up the bureaucracy, too much rigidity. I thought it was unworkable in rural areas and the way they were setting up some of this stuff. And that was my main concern with the bill. I didn't think that part of it would work. The pre-existing conditions, I never said that. And I would never say that, because that's the one good part of the bill, the most important part of the bill that I supported, you know, and the main reason why I didn't vote to repeal it.
Okay, last word on this, Dave Hughes.
Well, maybe you misspoke in 2016 as you did recently with something else, or maybe you forgot, but that is what you said in 16 with regard to Obamacare. So I stand by that statement, and Obamacare remains a failed public policy, and we need to get rid of it as soon as possible.
Okay, you did mention tax cuts. That's our next topic. Speaking of that, the president's tax cuts have passed. Congressman Peterson, you voted no, while you, Mr. Hughes, have said you would have voted yes. I want you to each talk about why you took that stance, what impact the cuts have had so far, and on the federal deficit. And Dave Hughes, you start us out.
Okay, I would have supported the tax cuts. It's obvious, and we've seen the evidence since then. Every economic indicator that anybody ever looks at, whether it's unemployment rate, workforce participation rate, home ownership rate, entrepreneurship rate, wages, everything, they're all up, and they're up dramatically since that tax cut was implemented. The arguments from the left about this and that just don't add up, and so I think it's been a great program. It's been a great boon for the economy of the United States and the prosperity of the American people. And I'm all in favor of tax cut 2.0 or tax reform 2.0. The president spoke about this a while back, and I support that. And that's because the reform from last year, it was more beneficial on the corporate side and less so on the personal side. Not that both didn't benefit, they did. But I think there's more work to be done on the individual side. And so going forward, I think we need to do that. I also favor a couple of things that the Farm Bureau favors that Collin and the Democrats don't favor. The Farm Bureau Federation is in favor of completely eliminating the estate tax. Democrats are adamantly against that because of class warfare politics. And I'm also in favor of eliminating the capital gains tax, which Democrats would never go for. So I'm stronger on those positions with regard to the farming community than my opponent. I think that's where we should go.
Collin Peterson responds.
Well, the part of the tax reform that I would have supported is lowering the corporate tax rate. And that's what I said in the last campaign, because we're out of whack with the rest of the world. And I supported lowering the corporate rate to 15%, which is where the rest of the world is. And so I was called by Kevin Brady into his office, along with some other 3 or 4 of us, when we were the first ones to see his tax bill. And I was surprised to find out that in that bill, he was going to repeal the interest deduction for all businesses. And they also created this pass-through situation which caused a lot of problems within the cooperative area and so forth. So they added things into this, and then they tried to simplify the individual taxes by eliminating a lot of itemized deductions and collapsing together the personal exemptions and the standard deduction. Well, if you're a big family, you're going to lose under this. People, when they go in and fill their taxes out this year, the individuals, a lot of families are going to find out that they have an increase in taxes, not a decrease. So if they would have limited this bill, and I told Kevin Brady this, to the corporate reduction, I would have supported it. That was $600 billion as opposed to $3 trillion or whatever the total bill was. You know, and at the time they passed it, they said, well, this bill is going to pay for itself. It didn't. It drove up the deficit. We just had to go up. They just announced 17%, and every outfit out there said that the reason it went up was because of the tax cuts. So, you know, there was a way that it could have been done, but I did not support it the way it was put together.
Okay, Dave Hughes, response.
Well, Collin, you're a CPA. You know better than what you just said. Basic economics is that tax cuts are great. They're stimulative for the economy, and so I support tax cuts, and they've been great. What you just said is incorrect. The reason that the deficit is going up, the reason our national debt is going up, is not because we're not receiving enough revenue into the Treasury. It's because members of Congress on both sides of the aisle for 100 years have been addicted to spending. I'm going to Washington to try to reverse that. We need to make spending cuts across the board. I don't mean a flat percentage across all the departments, but we need to do some tax spending cutting because that's the only way that we're going to balance our budgets and pay down our national debt. Talking about it wasn't paid for because you did a tax cut, that's just rhetoric, and it doesn't match reality. We know that the Congressional Budget Office, by statute, is required to do static scoring of tax cuts, and so you reduce taxes by a certain amount. They say, well, that's the reduction in revenue, and that's that, and it's pretty unintelligent and unsophisticated. But we know that when you reduce taxes, it has a stimulative effect on the economy, and that's why we've seen revenues go up even after these projections otherwise.
Collin Peterson, last word on tax cuts.
Well, the reality is, if this bill wouldn't have passed, the deficit wouldn't be anywhere near what it is right now, this year. That's the reality. You can talk all about cutting spending or whatever, you know, it took money out of the Treasury that we would have had otherwise. You know, and I think, as I said, the corporate rate was out of whack. That should have been fixed. But to come up with these pass-through stuff that they did, where you get, if you have a certain type of entity, you're going to get a 20% deduction for no reason. You know, they're just going to give you 20% off the top. You know, that is going to cause a lot of trouble, I'm guaranteeing you, as they define what a qualified income is and define how this is going to go be implemented going forward. So, you know, there's things in this bill that were a mistake. Again, if it would have been the corporate tax reduction, I'd have been there in a minute.
Okay, let's move on. I know neither of you vote on Supreme Court justices, but the Brett Kavanaugh hearings did engulf the nation for about the last month. I want your thoughts on Judge Kavanaugh, his accuser, Dr. Christine Ford, and how this whole confirmation process was handled. Collin Peterson, you go first.
Well, it was, you know, not a good situation for the country. It further divided us. You know, I think that I believe Dr. Ford, you know, would not have come forward had not she really believed that she had been abused. You know, Mr. Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh, you know, he gave a spirited defense. It's hard for me to sort out, you know, who to believe. But I will say that I thought that his, the way he comported himself in the second round that they had in the Judiciary Committee, it could have, you know, it did not befit Supreme Court justice, I thought. But it, you know, it is what it is, and we're past that. On the positions that Justice Kavanaugh takes, some of those I support. You know, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-gun. I think he is. You know, so I don't have any problem with that. But the way it was played out, it was just not good for the country.
Dave Hughes, response.
Collin, on point of view, you said that women need to be believed, and yet your best friend in Congress, Keith Ellison, are we supposed to believe the accusations against him? I'd like to know your answer to that. With regard to your question, The Kavanaugh situation was a debacle. The Democrats on the the Senate Judiciary Committee behaved in a way that's despicable. They mistreated Ms. Ford, Dr. Ford. They mistreated Justice Kavanaugh, and this whole scandal is a reason why the American people and the people of Western Minnesota ought to not vote for Collin Peterson. Because to vote for Collin is to put another Democrat back in there and to give the majority to the U.S. House of Representatives to the Democratic Party. And we saw with this behavior and the conduct of the Democrats in this Kavanaugh confirmation circus how they behave. Chairman Grassley was wonderful, and so were all the Republicans, frankly, on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, he nailed it when he said, look, Senator Feinstein completely misbehaved in that situation. She received Dr. Ford's letter way back in July, and if she had handled this like she and the others on that committee handle most situations, she would have gone to Chairman Grassley and said, look, I have this, and if we need to do a background on this discreetly, we can. Especially that would have honored Dr. Ford's request. But instead, she held it for political reasons to the very end and did all this and unleashed this whole fury that has the voters of Western Minnesota very upset. As a result of this whole thing, my signs are going up everywhere. They're all over the place, just in the last week or two as a result of this Kavanaugh scandal. And I think it illustrates what I'm saying, which is that we do not want the Democrats back in the majority in the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate anytime soon.
Collin Peterson, do you want to respond? No, move on. Okay, we'll move on to immigration and immigration reform. Mr. Hughes, you're strongly in favor of building the wall on the border. Congressman Peterson, I know you would favor some sort of immigration reform. Let's talk about immigration. Dave Hughes, you start off on this one.
Well, President Trump wants to build the wall on the southern border, but he also has a very thoughtful 70-point plan for immigration reform. It includes the wall, and nobody on my side is saying the wall is going to solve all problems. Nobody. And it won't. But his plan is a thoughtful, multi-layered, multi-tiered approach that includes interior enforcement. I'll tell you that in my present employment for the last 3.5 years since retiring from the Air Force, I do presently work for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and most of the guys I work with are former Border Patrol agents. And they tell me that in the previous administration for 8 straight years, they were disallowed from doing their job, from what federal law requires, which is called interior enforcement. And that's where they go to places of employment and catch lawbreakers. My unit in particular had a success recently in Grand Island, Nebraska, where they caught an employer there who was exploiting illegal aliens and mistreating them. We broke that up and released them and relieved them from that exploitation. So I am in favor of immigration reform, especially in legal immigration. Agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and really the American economy needs that labor. And so we need a new guest worker program, which could have been implemented this past spring if Democrats had voted for the Goodlatte bill, because that had a good guest worker program in there. Instead, Collin Peterson and others voted against it. And so I favor those types of reforms going forward with regard to immigration.
Collin Peterson responds.
Well, unfortunately, there is no big immigration reform bill that's on the horizon. But what is needed in this part of the world and in agriculture is we do need a way to get the workers for the dairy farms, for the fruit and vegetable industry, and so forth. So Representative Goodlatte has been working on a bill. And again, the Freedom Caucus, which my opponent wants to be part of, they held that bill hostage and made it a partisan bill. And it didn't go anyplace. So Bob, through this whole process, Bob Goodlatte, who's a good friend of mine, was working with me on this. And I said, I've got some things that I need you to change, and I can support this. So Bob finally did make the changes in the bill, and I signed on. And it's been now reintroduced with a new H-2C program, which would legalize a lot of folks to work in the agriculture industry. It sets up an E-Verify system that is going to be mandatory, and it has a touchback provision, which some of the people on the Republican side wanted. So I'm a co-sponsor of the bill. I'm getting more Democrats to sign on to it. And again, this is one of those big issues that unless you have a bipartisan coalition, it's not going to get done. But we need this in agriculture bad.
Dave Hughes responds.
Well, I just wanted to respond to Collin's comment about the Freedom Caucus. I have said in the past that I like them and that I might join them. I have thought about it over a period of time and have changed my mind about that. Not because I disagree with their policies necessarily, but because I want to be independent. There's a lot of conservative, like-minded folks in Washington, and I am very conservative, but I will remain independent of any caucus like the House Freedom Caucus. And that's in part because, well, I'll just say because I want to serve the people of Western Minnesota and not be beholden to a caucus.
Collin Peterson, response.
Well, again, I've signed on to Bob's bill. I think it's much improved, and it's improved because I worked with Bob, and he understood that he had to bring some Democrats on board, and I was the first one that came on board, and I brought some of my colleagues along with me since, and we're still working on co-sponsors. We probably won't get it done by the end of this Congress, but hopefully early in the next Congress we can get this bill passed.
A quick follow-up, Dave Hughes, is the wall feasible? Is it ever going to happen, do you think? Or how
it's absolutely feasible. If the political will in Congress to fund it is there, it's feasible. Walls work. That's why humans have been building them for 5,000 years. The Israelis have had great success with theirs. And it's not all that expensive, especially when you consider that the amount of immigration that would be stopped by having the wall would pay for itself because of frankly, the federal and state social welfare benefits that typically go to a number of immigrants. Certainly, most immigrants come here to work, but there's a percentage of them that go on the public dole, and that wall would stem that tide to some extent that it would pay for itself in the first year.
Last word, Collin Peterson?
Well, yeah, I'm not against the wall, but if you've been down to the border, there are places where that wall is not going to work. So it's got to be a combination of a wall in certain places and other types of electronics and surveillance and drones and whatever to make sure we can secure the border. So I'm not against the wall. But this idea that there's going to be a wall the entire way along the Mexico, Texas, Arizona, California border, that's not going to happen because there's places where you just cannot build a wall. So it's got to be a combination. And, I think we will eventually get it done.
Okay, I want to move to a couple foreign policy issues here. What is your views on the recent apparent murder of the Washington Post columnist at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and the administration reaction so far, and what would you both favor as some sort of reaction or investigation into this? Collin Peterson?
Well, I think, it should be investigated, and the administration, Secretary of State Pompeo, who was a friend of mine, I know him pretty well, says that we need some more time to investigate this. So I'm fine with giving them time to investigate it. I just heard coming over here that the Saudi government has now admitted that he was killed, and we don't have the details of exactly how it happened. But, we need to get a credible group to look into this to find out what actually happened, and then once we know that, then we'll have to make decisions about how you respond. But Saudi Arabia is an ally, and so we don't want to just destroy that relationship until we know what we're doing.
Dave Hughes, response.
Collin, thanks for mentioning the drones. I fly drones. I've got 3,200 hours in them, and I do that every day. This situation, it's still way too early to come to any conclusions. The administration is investigating it, and so I haven't drawn any conclusions yet, except I'll tell you that the mainstream media, of course, is breathless about this. There's a certain element, of course, to it that's very disheartening, the murder of this individual. But let's keep in mind that he wasn't some vanilla journalist. He reportedly has some ties to some really unsavory groups, maybe even terrorist groups, and so it's understandable why the Saudis would have had concern about him, but certainly that doesn't justify what we understand happened to him. So I'm going to wait for the facts to come out and for an investigation to come out. I'm troubled by it, but way too early to draw final conclusions.
Collin Peterson, do you have anything else? Okay, let's move on to another issue, and that's foreign policy with some of our allies. Europe, Canada have often been on some stinging criticism from President Trump on funding and things like that. In your views, is our standing different, better, worse in the world under President Trump versus President Obama? And Dave Hughes, you go first on this one.
Our standing in the world right now is much better than under the previous administration. Under President Obama, our friends recoiled at us, and our adversaries laughed at us. I think with President Trump, they understand he's the new sheriff in town, and so we have a much better situation. Our allies trust us, Israel especially, and our adversaries understand that we mean business. We've seen that with the trade agreements. National power, the instruments of national power include diplomacy, information, the military aspect of it, and of course economic. And so we've seen with President Trump a whole new approach to things, and I think the fact that the mainstream media is talking about we've lost standing in the world with regard to our friends and our allies, The fact that they're saying that means that it's untrue, frankly. And so you can take it to the bank that President Trump has improved our situation, and I support him fully.
Collin Peterson.
Well, I think it depends on what you're talking about. I think there's no question that the situation between us and Israel has improved under President Trump. Israel's very happy about the way he's moved and moving the embassy to Jerusalem. But in the case of Europe, I think it's pretty hard for anybody to make the case that our standing with Europe is better than it was before. I just don't see that. I don't believe that. And the way the president has approached NATO has been very troubling for a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. A lot of Republicans are concerned about the way he's talked about NATO, some of the things that he's put forward. And I understand the concerns about getting people to pay for it. But the way they went about this, has not been helpful. In the case of Canada, they were not happy with how all this stuff played out. Now where they're at now, I don't know, but I've had the Canadians in my office, and they were not happy with the way this trade thing was negotiated. They haven't said much about it, so I don't know. I can tell you this: things are not better. Some places they are, but I would say mostly we're probably where we were, or we're behind what we used to be.
Dave Hughes, response.
Well, with my 21 years on active duty in the U.S. Air Force, I have insight into this that few in Congress do. And I'll tell you, Collin just mentioned 2 or 3 times that the Europeans and the Canadians are not happy with us. That was the word he used. I'd like to emphasize that it's not in the American interest to make the Europeans and the Canadians happy. What is in our interest is to have them respect us so that we get what we want, which is best for the American people. I'm not so concerned if the Belgians are happy with the Americans. I'm not so concerned if the Czechs are happy with the Americans. I'm concerned that America's needs are met first and that our allies respect us, and that really is what the American people need. That's what Western Minnesotans want.
Collin Peterson.
Well, I maybe shouldn't have used the word happy, but what I was trying to say was that the rhetoric that went around NATO, our NATO allies, which are very important to us militarily, they were very concerned about the rhetoric and some of the proposals that were put out there. And I don't know how this will play out in the long run, but my concern is this, that we have to maintain a strong NATO. This has been a mainstay of our foreign policy, our military, and anything that we're going to do that's going to undermine that, I have big problems with.
Okay, let's move on to regulation, which has been a big issue under President Trump. Some relaxation on environmental regulations, energy, oil companies, things of this nature. Where do each of you balance regulation with industries, business, and the environment versus environmental needs and things like that? Collin Peterson, you go first.
Well, under the previous administration, I've been pretty clear that they went too far with a lot of these regulations. And the Obama administration, Gina McCarthy at EPA and some of them, I locked horns with them a number of times. So one thing that's positive about the Trump administration is they've taken on some of these regulations. And I have supported, I think, every single effort that there's been in Congress and from the president to rein in these regulations. The Waters of the U.S., the RAINS Act, any of these things that are going to shift the balance of power away from the bureaucracy in Washington back to the Congress. The RAINS Act, what that says is that you can't put a regulation in place, the agency can't do it unless the Congress approves it. And one of the big problems we have in government is that these agencies have more power to legislate than we have in Congress. And so when we pass a bill, it goes to the agency, then the agency does a whole other legislation, and the lobbyists all go over there and manipulate the situation, and we should not allow that. But the Administrative Procedures Act that was set up a long time ago gave them that power, and some of us are trying to rein that in. So that's one positive I'll give the Trump administration. They have taken on these regulations, and I am 100% behind supporting them on the Endangered Species Act, all these things. And I'm trying to get management of the wolf back into the DNR. This is one time where I get along with the DNR, get the hunting season back on wolves. I've been working on that for a long time, and I think we're going to get that done pretty soon.
Dave Hughes responds.
Early in 2017, at the very beginning of this administration, the president and conservatives in Congress used the Congressional Review Act to slash regulations, and there's been great success with that because lowering regulations allows the economy to accelerate and do better, and so that was great. I'm glad you cited the REINS Act. I support the REINS Act. Waters of the United States, here's the problem. Collin seems to have the correct point of view on that, but Nancy Pelosi aggressively wants to go in the opposite direction of conservatives and what you have stated. And so for the voters out there, the listeners out there, if you vote for Collin Peterson, you're voting to put Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House. And she and the other radical leftist environmentalists in her caucus, they want to bring waters of the U.S. back. They don't want to scrub it. You've had 2 years to get rid of WOTUS, and it still exists. I said this 2 years ago that we need to permanently get rid of it. We need to defund it and not allow a federal judge somewhere to implement it in some states because the Congress hasn't done their job and permanently banned it. So WOTUS needs to be gotten rid of. And in general, we need to expand the economy of the United States and all things energy, exploration, mining, and all that stuff. But as always, I'm a deep environmentalist, and so we always have to be stewards of the environment. And we have to achieve that balance. The problem is my friends on the left don't know what balance is, and they always want the pendulum to go way too far, you know, talking about reducing greenhouse gases and the Earth's temperature by 0.01 degrees at the cost of $100 trillion over some period of time. So let's impoverish the world's people and reduce the temperature by a tiny little bit. That's the balance that they don't understand, but I do.
Collin Peterson responds.
Well, I think the waters of the U.S. is a good example of what's wrong with the way the bureaucracy and the rulemaking operates. Because the Obama administration sent a final rule up on waters of the U.S., it was challenged in court, but because it was a final rule, we cannot, believe it or not, the Congress cannot repeal it under the rules that we've got set up. We have tried. We can't repeal it. We can defund it. But one of the problems, Dave, is that the Senate, we passed all these bills and the Senate didn't pass any of them, even though it's controlled by Republicans. You know, so now we've got a situation where waters of the U.S., they're going to put together a new rule, which they have to do in order to get rid of the old rule, and it's not going to be put out until fall of 2019, you know, because of the way the structure works, you know. So we have to get into the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, that gives these agencies the power to do this legislating, and we need to rein that in. And there's bills that we've introduced to do that. Rob Portman and myself, John Kasich, when he was there, worked on this for years, and we're finally making some progress. But the big trouble we can get it through the House now, but the problem is not Nancy Pelosi. The problem is the United States Senate getting this done.
Dave Hughes responds.
Well, Collin said a couple of things that are incorrect. One, you might not be able to repeal the rule, but you can obviate the rule by rewriting the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. Well, if we'll do that, then the rule goes away.
Nobody's put that forward.
Well, have you done that in the last 2 years?
Yes, we talked about it.
You didn't get it done?
Well, so I'm not in charge. The Republicans are in charge.
Yeah. Well, but for all the clout that you supposedly have after 28
years. But the
years.
Agriculture Committee has no jurisdiction over waters of the U.S. That's a different committee. It's a different agency that we have no control over. So if it was in the Agriculture Committee, I'll guarantee you this would be fixed. We don't have jurisdiction.
Last word.
One last thing with regard to regulation. Some of that is overseen by the House Judiciary Committee. If folks vote for Collin Peterson and put Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, Maxine Waters will be the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and she's not going to support any of this rollback of regulations. And so that's one more reason why the voters of Western Minnesota ought to vote for me and not Collin Peterson.
Okay, I want to quickly get a couple more issues. The Iran nuclear deal, your thoughts on this, and also on President Trump's dealings with North Korea. Dave Hughes, you go first on this one.
Yeah, the Iran nuclear deal was a disaster. I'm glad that the president withdrew from that. Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and we need to deal with them from a position of strength, not one where we're bound to some deal that wasn't good from the start. So bravo and cheers to President Trump for doing that. That was in the interest of the United States of America. With regard to North Korea, he has made some very good progress with them. We've got a conversation going. They've stopped testing, they've stopped development, all subject, of course, to trust but verify, in the words of a former president. But we're making a lot of progress there that President Clinton didn't do, and neither did Obama or any of the other presidents before him. So President Trump has done a great job with regard to both of those, and I will support him going forward as we try to achieve those objectives.
Collin Peterson response.
Yeah, I didn't support the Iran agreement, and I'm glad that we're dismantling it because I thought it was a bad deal. It gave Iran a whole bunch of money for, I thought, very dubious reasons, and so I'm happy about that. Israel is happy that we've undone that, and that's one of the reasons we have to be a little bit careful with Saudi Arabia in terms of making sure that Iran is contained going forward. And in North Korea, I will give the administration credit for what they've been able to accomplish there. We have, I think, made progress. We're at least talking, and that's a lot further. We only had Bill Richardson, that was the only guy that was able to talk to North Korea, and now we have, the president and others that are, in a position to talk to them. So that is progress, and I'm glad to see that. And these are areas when I've been happy to support the administration. I have 69% support with the Trump administration on a number of different issues, and that is regulations, these kinds of issues, where I've agreed with what they're doing, and I think in both of those cases they're doing the right thing.
Okay, we're almost to closing statements, but quickly, 1 minute each. Congressman Peterson, what do you think is the most pressing issue facing this nation right now going forward?
The nation?
Yep.
I think the most pressing issue is trying to figure out how we can work together again, in this country, and not be so divided. And it's within the Congress, it's within the Senate, within the House, it's in these elections, it's within the news media. We are just, seems like, at each other's throats, and not able to get anything together to do what needs to be done for the people. And this is what I hear from my constituents all the time. How are you guys going to get this back together so you can start working together again? When I came there in 1991, it was a whole different world. And it's continued to get worse and worse and worse because they have taken the power away from the committees. And they've consolidated it up at the leadership level in both parties. And this is part of what's caused all this partisanship, and we've got to get that untangled.
Dave Hughes, about a minute left on that issue.
Yeah, President Trump's Director of Office of Management and Budget is Mick Mulvaney. When he was being confirmed a couple of years ago and being mistreated by the senators, especially Senator Tester of Montana, he was asked, what's the greatest challenge to the United States of America? He quoted former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Navy Admiral Mike Mullen, who said, it's not China, it's not Russia, it's not Islamic terrorism, it's the American national debt. If we do not balance our budgets and get our national debt paid down and paid off, this country faces the risk of bankruptcy. And so people are elected to Congress to be leaders, to look out on the horizon and see what's coming, to project what's coming, and to do something about it sooner rather than later. Congressman Peterson has been in office for 28 years. Our national debt has gone up from $3 trillion to $21 trillion. And he's had no success in addressing that challenge. And I tell the folks of Western Minnesota that I will make that one of my very highest priorities, because we can talk about the Farm Bill, we can talk about any number of other things, but if the country goes down the tubes financially, if it goes bankrupt and it can't pay its bills, then all the rest of that is of very little use. And so we have to get back to balanced budgets, which we did in the 1990s.
Okay, we need to get to closing statements. You each have up to 90 seconds. Dave Hughes, you're first.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, AARP and Prairie Public Television for hosting this tonight. My name is Dave Hughes. I am the Republican candidate for Congress in Minnesota 7. I am running for Congress because I think that the people of Western Minnesota need true conservative leadership. Congressman Peterson has for years been lauded as being conservative over issues such as pro-life and the pro-gun, but for his entire 28 years, his campaign has given money to Democratic candidates up and down the ticket who are wildly against those values. The one most recently that I know of, she's very anti-Second Amendment and very pro-abortion. So that betrays those issues, and those are valuable to the people of Western Minnesota. So why vote for somebody who maybe is a little bit conservative or is sort of conservative, touts himself by a newspaper saying that he's the most bipartisan member of Congress, when you can have a true conservative who represents the values of Western Minnesota? I will work with President Trump. I will not oppose him. Collin said that he votes with him 69% of the time. I'm sure I'm going to be closer to 89 or 99% of the time. So do you want a real conservative or a pseudo-conservative? Do you want somebody who's in the majority party that's going to work with Sonny Perdue, the ag secretary, and the president, or somebody who has no relationship with either of them and is going to oppose them? I humbly ask for your vote November 6th because I want to continue this train of winning We're growing in our economy. We're going to see 5, 6, 7% annual growth in our economy. But if you vote for Collin Peterson, you're voting to put Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in charge. And they're going to bring all of that to a screeching halt. They're going to investigate the president. They're going to implement.
That's time up on the closing.
Thank you very much.
Collin Peterson, closing statement.
Well, thank Prairie Public and AARP for doing this debate. And I want to tell the folks of the 7th District that it has been an honor for me to be able to represent you in Washington. I've tried to do it in an honest, bipartisan, independent way. And frankly, in my opinion, we need more of that, not less, in this country. The biggest problem we have is the partisanship that has gotten worse and worse and worse as I've been in office, to the point where some people in the caucus, in the Republican caucus or Democratic caucus, will not even talk to anybody in the other party. You know, and that is not helping us as a country. Now, I agree that the debt is a big problem. And I have supported the balanced budget amendment for the last 20-some years. We've never been able to get it up for a vote, get it passed, but we should. You know, and you know, I was there in the 90s with Bill Clinton when we actually balanced the budget. You know, but then 9/11 happened, and the wars and all the other things got us out of whack. The financial situation, you know, and now we're making progress again. That's one of the problems I had with these tax cuts. You know, if they would have just done the corporate tax cut, that would have been $600 billion. We could have afforded that. But what they did, busted the bank. And they said, oh, it's going to pay for itself. It didn't. So if you really, you know, want to get this country back on track, you're going to have to, you know, make sure that the revenues match up with the spending. So I appreciate the support of the people, and I appreciate the time tonight.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. Collin Peterson, Dave Hughes, for a lively, informative debate. Thank you for watching Prairie Public's continuing coverage of Election 2018. Remember, Election Day is November 6th, and early voting is underway. So long.
With the midterm elections just days away, watch the competition for the control of Congress on C-SPAN. See for yourself the candidate